For over 2,500 years, people just like you have turned to the Buddha's teachings when the world felt too heavy, when the mind wouldn't stop spinning, when rest seemed impossible to find tonight. You join that ancient lineage of seekers, and the Buddha's gift is as fresh now as it was then. These aren't stories about perfection or enlightenment in some far-off future. They're stories about being human, about suffering and the end of suffering, about finding peace, not by escaping your life, but by finally, fully arriving in it. The wisdom we'll explore tonight doesn't require you to believe anything or change everything. It simply asks you to listen, to soften, to notice. The peace you're longing for isn't locked away. It's right here, closer than your next breath. I'm curious about your experience with these teachings. What is it that these Buddha stories bring into your life? Do they calm your restless mind, help you sleep more peacefully, offer you a different way of seeing your challenges? I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments below. Each story we'll share tonight is like a key, not to open something locked, but to help you realize that the door was never closed at all. The Buddha discovered something remarkable, that suffering is optional, that peace is our natural state, that we can learn to hold our pain with such tenderness that it transforms. Let these teachings settle into you tonight without force or effort. You don't need to remember them or practice them or even fully understand them. Just let them be here with you, like a trusted friend sitting quietly by your side. Before we enter the first story, take a moment to care for yourself. Find a way of resting that truly supports you. Maybe you need to release the tension in your jaw, or let your legs fall open slightly, or pull the blankets up just a little higher. Whatever your body needs to feel held and safe, give yourself that gift now. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Draw in a long, slow breath through your nose, and as you exhale, imagine releasing any remaining tension from this day. Another breath, deep and nourishing, filling you with calm and release. Now we're ready. Let's begin with our first story. In the mountains far from any town, there lived a hermit named Ryanan who had retreated from society to live in solitude. He had built a small hut beside a stream and spent his days in meditation, contemplation, and simple living. He sought no company, spoke to no one, desired only silence and solitude. Ryanan had not always been a hermit. For many years, he had lived in the capital city, working as a scholar at a prestigious academy. He had been surrounded by people constantly, engaged in endless conversations, debates, and social obligations. His days were filled with meetings, his evenings with gatherings, his mind always occupied with the opinions and expectations of others. He had been respected in those days, successful by any measure, but he had felt increasingly hollow, as if the constant engagement with others was somehow preventing him from engaging with himself. Every conversation pulled him outward. Every social obligation demanded he present a certain face, play a certain role. He began to feel like a performer in his own life, never quite sure who he was beneath all the performances. So one day, without announcement or explanation, Ryanan left. He walked away from his position, his reputation, his comfortable life, and disappeared into the mountains. He wanted only to be alone, to find in solitude what he had lost in society. For the first year, he lived in complete isolation. He built his hut with his own hands, slowly and carefully, in no particular hurry. He learned to grow simple vegetables. He learned the rhythms of the mountain, the patterns of weather, and the habits of the animals who shared the forest. He sat in meditation for hours each day, not trying to achieve anything, just sitting with the silence. The silence was difficult at first. His mind was so accustomed to constant stimulation that it created its own noise, replaying conversations, imagining scenarios, filling the quiet with internal chatter. But gradually, over months, the internal noise began to settle. Gaps appeared between thoughts. The silence became less empty and more full, filled with the subtle sounds of wind in trees, water over stones, his own breathing. Rhiannon found that in this silence, he could hear things he had never heard before. Not voices or supernatural sounds, but deeper truths about himself and about life. Insights would arise naturally, not from thinking or reasoning, but from simply being present. He began to understand things he had studied for years, but never really grasped. The difference between knowledge and wisdom. The difference between being alone and being lonely. The difference between silence and emptiness. But something strange began to happen. The more Rhiannon retreated into solitude, the more visitors he attracted. At first, it was just a wandering monk who happened upon his hut and asked for water. Rhiannon gave him water, and the monk went on his way. But somehow, word spread. There was a hermit in the mountains, someone who had given up the world, someone who lived in complete simplicity and silence. People began to seek him out. They would make the long journey up the mountain path, arriving at his hut with questions, seeking wisdom, wanting to learn from this man who had withdrawn from society. At first, Rhiannon was dismayed. He had come to the mountains precisely to escape people, to be alone. When he saw visitors approaching, he would hide inside his hut, waiting for them to leave. But they wouldn't leave. They would sit outside his door, sometimes for days, patient and persistent. Eventually, Rhiannon realized that hiding was pointless. These people had traveled far to see him. The least he could do was acknowledge them. So he began to receive visitors, though reluctantly. He would listen to their questions and offer what responses came to him. He never tried to be wise or profound. He simply spoke from his experience of solitude and silence. The puzzling thing was that the more plainly he spoke, the more wisdom people found in his words. When he'd lived in the city, surrounded by people, busy with social obligations and scholarly debates, no one had sought his wisdom particularly. He had been respected, certainly, but not sought out as a teacher. Now that he had nothing to say and no desire to teach, people traveled great distances to hear from him. One day, he asked a visitor directly, "Why do you come here?" "I was a scholar once, surrounded by books and ideas and other learned people. No one traveled to seek my wisdom then. Now I live in a hut in the mountains. I've read no books in years, and I have no new ideas to offer. Why travel so far to talk to someone who has nothing to give you?" The visitor, a merchant named Taro, who had closed his business for a week to make this journey, thought carefully before answering. "In town," Taro said, "everyone is so busy talking that no one is listening. Everyone has so many ideas, so many opinions, so much they want to say that there's no space for wisdom to emerge. Conversations are just people waiting for their turn to speak, not actually hearing each other. You're different. You have silence. You have space. When you speak, even just a few words, they matter because they come from stillness rather than from the noise of a busy mind. He shifted his position on the ground where they sat. And there's something else. In the city, I'm surrounded by people, but I feel more alone than you probably do here in your solitude. Everyone wants something from me. They want my money, my influence, my agreement, my approval. Every conversation has an agenda. But you want nothing from me. You didn't ask me to come here. You gain nothing from talking to me. That makes your words trustworthy. I can actually hear them because I'm not wondering what you're trying to get from me. Another visitor, a young woman named Hana, who had been struggling with the question of whether to marry a man her family had chosen, explained her reason for coming. Everyone in my life has an opinion about what I should do, she said. My parents think I should marry this man because it's a good match for the family. My friends think I should refuse because I don't love him. Everyone is so certain, so full of advice, so ready to tell me the right answer. But you're the first person who didn't immediately tell me what to do. You just listened. And in that listening, in that space you created, I could finally hear my own wisdom. The answer was in me all along, but I couldn't hear it over everyone else's voices. Ryonan began to understand. It wasn't despite his solitude that people sought him out, but because of it. In his withdrawal from society, he had created something increasingly rare. Space, silence, presence unburdened by agenda or expectation. And people were drawn to that the way thirsty travelers are drawn to water in the desert. He noticed something else too. The wisdom people attributed to him wasn't really his wisdom at all. It emerged from the silence he had cultivated. In the stillness of his solitary life, he could hear things that the noise of society drowned out. He could see clearly because his vision wasn't constantly pulled in multiple directions. He could speak truthfully because he had no reputation to protect, no social position to defend, no need to appear wise or knowledgeable. In the city, he had been so concerned with how others perceived him, with maintaining his scholarly reputation, with not saying anything foolish, that his words had been calculated and careful. Now, with no one to impress and nothing to lose, he simply said what was true. And paradoxically, this made his words more valuable. A scholar from the academy where Ryonan had once taught made the journey to see him. The scholar, a man named Masao, who had been Ryonan's colleague, couldn't understand why Ryonan had left such a prestigious position. "You were brilliant," Masao said. "You could have become the head of the academy. You could have written books that would have been studied for generations. Instead, you're here in a hut in the mountains, accomplishing nothing. Don't you feel you've wasted your potential?" Ryonan smiled. "When I was at the academy, I was surrounded by brilliant people, impressive ideas, important work. But I felt empty. I was always performing, always trying to prove something, always concerned with how others judged me and my ideas. Here, I accomplish nothing by the world's standards, but I'm not empty anymore." "But you could have influenced so many people from that position," Masao protested. "I influence more people now," Ryonan replied quietly. "Not through my scholarship or my position, but through my presence. People come here seeking something they can't find in the busy world, and I can offer it to them precisely because I've stepped out of that busy world. If I had stayed at the academy, I would have had a position and a reputation, but I wouldn't have had what these people are seeking." Masao looked uncomfortable. "What exactly are they seeking?" "Space," Ryanan said. "Silence. Someone who will listen without agenda. Someone who isn't trying to convince them of anything or get anything from them. Someone who has stepped out of the endless competition and comparison and striving that fills the world. I couldn't offer that while I was still caught up in it myself." He gestured to the quiet forest around them. "This solitude isn't empty, as you seem to think. It's full of attention, presence, awareness. When you're constantly busy, constantly engaged, constantly consuming information and experience and interaction, there's no space for anything deeper to emerge. You fill your life so completely with activity that wisdom has nowhere to appear. But when you create space, when you embrace solitude even briefly, wisdom has room to arise." Masao stayed for 3 days, and during that time, something shifted in him. The first day, he kept trying to debate and discuss, to engage Ryanan in the kind of intellectual sparring they had done at the academy. But Ryanan wouldn't engage. He would simply sit in silence or make tea or suggest they walk in the forest. At first, Masao found this frustrating, but by the second day, he began to notice something. His mind, which was usually so busy with thoughts and arguments and analyses, was beginning to quiet. In the space Ryanan created through his silence, Masao's own deeper thoughts could finally surface. By the third day, Masao understood. "You're teaching me even though you're not saying much of anything," he said. "The teaching is in the space itself, in the silence. I can hear my own wisdom because you're not filling all the space with yours." Ryanan nodded. "At the academy, we competed to be the most impressive speaker, the most brilliant thinker. We filled every silence with words, every space with ideas. But wisdom doesn't emerge from fullness. It emerges from emptiness. The sage isn't the one with the most to say, but the one who creates space for what needs to be heard." Years passed, and Ryanan's hut became something of a pilgrimage site. But he never encouraged this. He never advertised his presence or claimed any special wisdom. He simply continued living as he had been, in solitude and silence, receiving those who came to him but never seeking them out. One day, a young man arrived who reminded Ryanan of himself many years ago. The young man was ambitious, successful, recognized in his field, but he was also hollow, exhausted, playing a role rather than living a life. "Should I give it all up?" the young man asked. "Should I leave society like you did?" Ryanan looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that?" "Because you found peace here. You found wisdom. Maybe I need to become a hermit too." "I didn't find peace because I became a hermit," Ryanan said. "I became a hermit because I needed to find peace and I couldn't find it in the busy world. But the lesson isn't that everyone should flee to the mountains. The lesson is about creating space, cultivating silence, stepping back from constant busyness and engagement. You can do that without leaving society." He poured tea for both of them. Some people need to physically retreat to learn solitude. Others can cultivate it right in the middle of the busy world. The external form matters less than the internal reality. What matters is whether you create space in your life for silence, for reflection, for listening to deeper wisdom. Whether you do that in a hut on a mountain or in a house in a city, the principle is the same. The young man looked disappointed. So you're not going to tell me to become a hermit? I'm going to tell you to become familiar with solitude, Rhiannon replied. To learn to be alone without being lonely. To create spaces in your busy life where you're not consuming, not producing, not performing, just being. Maybe that means taking a walk alone each day. Maybe it means sitting in silence for an hour each morning. Maybe it means turning off all your devices for one day a week and just being present to yourself and to life. The specific form doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop filling every moment with activity and create space for something deeper to emerge. He looked out at the forest. People come here thinking I have some special wisdom to give them. But all I really offer is space and silence. And they discover that in that space, their own wisdom can finally be heard. The wisdom was always there. It was just drowned out by noise and busyness. Solitude doesn't create wisdom. It reveals the wisdom that was hidden. The young man stayed for a week, and each day Rhiannon gave him less and less instruction. By the end of the week, they would sit together for hours without speaking, just being present to the silence and to each other. And the young man found that these silent hours taught him more than all the words he had heard in years of seeking teachers and reading books. When he left, he thanked Rhiannon. I thought you would teach me something. Instead, you showed me how to hear what I already knew. That's the only teaching worth giving, Rhiannon replied. As more years passed, Rhiannon noticed an interesting pattern. The people who traveled to see him once rarely came back. It wasn't that they were disappointed, but rather that they had learned what they needed to learn. They had experienced solitude, discovered their own inner wisdom, and carried that back to their lives. They didn't need to keep returning because the teaching wasn't dependent on his physical presence. It was about a principle they could apply anywhere. A few visitors did return, usually in times of crisis or transition, and Rhiannon always received them, but he noticed that these return visits were shorter. The people knew now how to create their own space, their own silence. They came not because they needed him specifically, but because his hut represented a physical manifestation of the inner solitude they were learning to cultivate. One day, an old friend from his academy days came to visit. This friend, whose name was Kenji, had become the head of the academy, achieving the position Rhiannon could have had. He arrived looking exhausted, burdened by responsibility and expectation. I've achieved everything we once talked about achieving, Kenji said. I have the position, the respect, the influence. So why do I feel so empty? Rhiannon recognized this emptiness. It was what he had felt all those years ago, what had driven him to the mountains. Because you have everything except space, Rhiannon said. Your life is so full of accomplishment that there's no room left for being. You've filled every moment with doing, and you've lost touch with the silence beneath all the doing. But I can't just abandon everything, Kenji protested. I have responsibilities. People depend on me. I'm not suggesting you abandon anything, Rhiannon replied. I'm suggesting you find spaces within your full life where you can be empty, even brief moments of solitude, of silence, of stopping. These moments are not wasted time. They're the moments where you reconnect with who you are beneath all your roles and responsibilities. He stood up and walked to the edge of his small clearing. I came to the mountains because I needed radical solitude to remember myself. But now I carry that solitude with me. Even when visitors are here, even when I'm engaged with others, there's a core of silence in me that remains untouched. That's what you need to find. Not external solitude necessarily, but internal solitude that you can access even in the middle of busyness. Kenji stayed for several days, and Ryanan taught him simple practices. Sitting in silence for even 10 minutes each morning. Taking a walk alone without purpose or destination. Eating one meal a day without distraction, just noticing the food and the act of eating. Creating small pockets of solitude within a busy life. When Kenji returned to the academy, he began implementing these practices, and he found that these small moments of solitude transformed his entire experience of his busy life. He was less reactive, more present, more capable of hearing his own wisdom beneath the noise of constant demands. He wrote to Ryanan, "I understand now what you've been teaching. Solitude isn't about being alone. It's about creating space. And that space is what allows wisdom to emerge, what allows us to hear truth, what allows us to be present rather than just constantly doing. Thank you for showing me that I didn't need to abandon my life. I just needed to find space within it." Ryanan smiled when he read this letter. This was the real teaching. Not that everyone should become a hermit, but that everyone needs solitude in some form. Space where they're not performing, not producing, not consuming, just being. As Ryanan grew older, he noticed that fewer visitors came, not because his reputation had diminished, but because the teaching had spread. People had learned to create their own solitude, their own silence. They didn't need to journey to a hut in the mountains because they had learned to find that mountain stillness within themselves wherever they were. One evening, as Ryanan sat watching the sunset from his hut, he reflected on the paradox of his life. He had retreated to solitude, seeking only to be alone, and in doing so, he had touched more lives than he ever had in his busy years at the academy. By wanting nothing, he had given something valuable. By seeking no students, he had taught countless people. By embracing emptiness, he had offered fullness. The teaching wasn't really his, he realized. It was simply what emerged when space was created. The wisdom people found when they visited him wasn't his wisdom. It was their own wisdom, finally audible in the silence he created around himself. He was just a mirror, reflecting back to people what they already knew but had forgotten in the noise of their busy lives. Tonight, as you rest, you're entering into solitude. Not the solitude of a hermit in the mountains, but the solitude of sleep, of withdrawal from the day's engagements, of stepping back from constant doing into simple being. In this solitude, you might find what busy people seek from hermits: space where your own wisdom can be heard, silence where truth can emerge, emptiness where fullness becomes apparent. You don't need to travel to mountains or build a hut or give up your life. You just need to create moments like this one. Moments where you stop filling every space with activity and allow silence to speak. The wisdom you're seeking isn't somewhere else. It's here in you, waiting to be heard. But it can only be heard in silence, in solitude, in the space you create by ceasing to be constantly busy. Rest now in the solitude of this moment. Let the silence teach you. Let the space fill you. What you've been seeking in all your busy engagement with the world is here, has always been here, waiting in the quiet. Solitude doesn't attract wisdom from outside. It reveals the wisdom that was always inside, just waiting for space to emerge. Be still, be silent, be empty, and discover that emptiness is the fullness you've been seeking all along. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a bustling market town, there were two merchants who sold rice side by side. One was named Kenji, the other Taro. Both had successful businesses. Both were known throughout the region. But their approaches to business could not have been more different. Kenji used scales that he had carefully adjusted to weigh slightly in his favor. Not much, just enough that most customers wouldn't notice. Over the course of a year, this small deception added significantly to his profits. He told himself everyone did it, that it was just smart business, that customers expected to be cheated a little and factored it into their calculations. Taro, on the other hand, used scales that were calibrated perfectly. He would even add a bit extra to each purchase, telling customers, better to give too much than too little. His profits were smaller than Kenji's, but his conscience was clear. Kenji would mock Taro privately. "You're a fool," he would say. "You could be making so much more. The customers don't know the difference. Why cheat yourself?" "I'm not cheating myself," Taro would reply. "I'm paying myself in peace of mind. Every transaction I make, I know I've been honest. That's worth more to me than extra profit." "Peace of mind doesn't feed your family," Kenji scoffed. "Money feeds your family." For years this continued. Kenji's business appeared more successful. He had a larger house, finer clothes, and more luxuries. Taro lived modestly, comfortable, but not wealthy. To outside observers, Kenji's approach seemed vindicated. Then one day, a wealthy lord came to the market to purchase rice for his household. He was known for being meticulous and for testing merchants' honesty. He had brought his own perfectly calibrated scales. He went first to Kenji's stall and purchased a measure of rice. Then he weighed it on his own scales. The shortage was immediately apparent. "Your scales are dishonest," the lord said coldly. Kenji's face went white. "My lord, there must be some mistake." "Perhaps your scales are inaccurate." "My scales are tested regularly by the Imperial Standards Office," the lord replied. "Yours are deliberately fraudulent. Not only will I not purchase from you, but I will ensure that everyone in my household and in my social circle knows of your dishonesty." The lord then went to Taro's stall and made the same purchase. When he weighed it on his own scales, he found that Taro had actually given more than the agreed upon amount. "Your scales are generous," the lord said with approval. "I prefer to err on the side of giving too much," Taro replied simply. "Then you have earned my business and my recommendation," the lord said. "From now on, all the rice for my household will be purchased from you, and I will tell others of your integrity." Within weeks, Taro's business had doubled, then tripled. The lord's recommendation brought customers from the wealthiest families in the region. Meanwhile, Kenji's business collapsed. Once word spread about his dishonest scales, even his regular customers stopped coming. His reputation destroyed, he eventually had to close his stall. Years later, Kenji came to Taro, humbled and seeking work. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought honesty was expensive, but dishonesty cost me everything." Taro hired him, but on one condition, that Kenji help maintain the scales, calibrating them regularly to ensure perfect accuracy. "You need to rebuild your relationship with honesty," Taro said. "Start here, with these scales. Every time you calibrate them, remember that integrity isn't about what others can see. It's about what you know about yourself." As Kenji worked with the honest scales day after day, something shifted in him. He had spent so many years cheating in small ways that he had forgotten what it felt like to be completely honest. The dishonesty had eaten at him in ways he hadn't even recognized, creating a constant low-level anxiety about being discovered, a subtle shame he carried everywhere. Now, working with honest scales, treating every customer fairly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Simple peace. No anxiety about being caught. No shame about his methods. No exhausting mental calculations about how much he could get away with. One day, a customer accidentally gave him too much money. The old Kenji would have pocketed it without comment. But now, without even thinking, he called the customer back and returned the extra coins. "You've changed," Taro observed, watching this exchange. "I'm remembering who I was before I started cheating," Kenji replied. "I forgot that honesty feels good, that it's actually easier than dishonesty because you don't have to remember your lies or worry about being discovered. I thought I was taking a shortcut to success, but I was actually taking a shortcut to misery." He looked at the scales, perfectly balanced. "These scales are the most honest thing in this market. They don't calculate or scheme or try to get away with anything. They just measure truly. I spent years being more clever than these scales and less wise." Taro nodded. "The scales teach a simple lesson. Integrity is its own reward. Not because good things always happen to honest people, but because living with integrity creates internal peace that no amount of profit gained through dishonesty can match. You sleep better. You walk lighter. You meet people's eyes without flinching. These things have value that can't be measured in coins." A young merchant who was just starting came to Taro for advice. "Everyone says I should adjust my scales just a little, that it's how business is done. But it feels wrong. What should I do?" Taro had Kenji answer. "I spent 20 years cheating," Kenji said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to restore the character I damaged in myself. The extra profit wasn't worth it. Not even close. Your scales are a mirror of your character. Keep them honest, and you keep yourself honest. Cheat them, and you cheat yourself in ways that matter far more than money." The young merchant looked at Kenji with curiosity. "But didn't you make more money by cheating?" "For a while," Kenji admitted. "But I lost it all when my dishonesty was discovered. More importantly, I lost something that took much longer to rebuild. My ability to respect myself. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a cheat. Every time I counted my profits, I knew they were partly stolen. Every interaction with customers involved acting, pretending, and hiding what I really was. It was exhausting and corrosive." He gestured to the perfectly balanced scales. "These scales are at peace. They have nothing to hide, nothing to defend. nothing to remember or cover up. They just are what they are. That's what integrity gives you. The peace of being what you are without pretense or deception. It's the most valuable thing I've learned, and I learned it the hard way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own scales. Where in your life are you adjusting the balance, even slightly in your own favor? Where are you being less than completely honest, with others or with yourself? These small dishonesties might seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They create a background noise of anxiety and shame that you carry everywhere. What would it feel like to calibrate your scales perfectly? To be completely honest, even when no one is watching, even when you could get away with a small deception. Not because of fear of being caught, but because integrity itself is the reward. Because living with honest scales creates an internal peace that no amount of clever advantage taking can provide. Rest tonight in honesty. Let go of all the small ways you've been adjusting the scales. Let go of the exhausting mental work of maintaining deceptions. Be like the perfectly balanced scale, true, honest, at peace with what you are. The reward isn't somewhere in the future. The reward is the immediate relief of no longer having to hide, to calculate, to worry about being discovered. Honest scales don't lie awake at night. Neither do honest hearts. There was a fisherman named Sato who lived in a coastal village where fishing was both a livelihood and a tradition. Every morning the fishermen would go out in their boats, and every evening they would return with their catches. The measure of a good fisherman was simple. How many fish did you catch? Sato had been fishing since childhood. He knew the waters, understood the tides, and could read the weather. But despite all his skill and knowledge, he had a problem that plagued him. At least once a week, sometimes more, he would return with an empty net. Not a small catch, not a few fish, empty. Other fishermen would return with boats full of fish, and Sato would be pulling up nets that contained nothing but seaweed and water. It was humiliating. People in the village began to see him as unlucky, perhaps even incompetent, despite his years of experience. Sato's wife, Hana, watched her husband grow increasingly frustrated and ashamed. He would come home from these empty net days silent and dejected, barely eating, questioning his worth as a fisherman and as a provider. One day, after a particularly discouraging week where Sato had returned empty-handed 3 times, Hana said something unexpected. "I'm glad you caught no fish today." Sato looked at her in disbelief. "How can you say that?" "We need the income. The other fishermen are successful. I'm failing." "Come with me," Hana said, taking his hand. She led him to the small shrine at the edge of their property, where they would leave offerings for good fortune. On the offering plate were several small items: 3 unusual shells, a piece of interesting driftwood, a small colored stone. "Where did these come from?" Sato asked. "From your empty nets," Hana replied. "On the days when you caught no fish, you brought home these things instead. You were so focused on what you didn't catch that you never looked at what you did bring back." She picked up one of the shells. "This one you brought back 2 weeks ago. I'd never seen a shell like this before. I showed it to the teacher at the school, and she used it to teach the children about sea life. Those children learned something beautiful from your empty net." She picked up the driftwood. This piece is so interesting in shape that the temple carver asked if he could use it for a small Buddha statue. Your failure brought something that will become sacred art. Sato looked at these objects with new eyes. He had indeed pulled them from his nets on empty days, but he had seen them as worthless, just debris that mocked him by taking the place of fish. "But we can't eat shells and driftwood," he protested. "We need fish to sell." "We need some fish," Hannah agreed, "and you catch enough on your successful days. But these empty net days bring other things, things with value that can't be measured in money, and they bring something else too." "What?" "They bring your presence home to me," she said quietly. "On days when you catch many fish, you come home exhausted but proud, and you spend the evening repairing nets and equipment, already planning the next day. But on empty net days, you sit with me, you talk with me. You're actually here, not already out on the boat in your mind. I know this sounds selfish, but I treasure those days when you come home empty-handed, because I get all of you, not just your tired body." This perspective shook something loose in Sato. He had been measuring his worth entirely by fish caught, seeing empty nets as pure failure. But Hannah was showing him that those apparently failed days brought other things, things he had been too ashamed to notice. A few days later, on another empty net morning, Sato pulled up his nets and found not fish, but a tangled mass of seaweed. His first reaction was the familiar frustration. But then he remembered Hannah's words and looked at the seaweed more carefully. It was a type he had seen farmers collecting for fertilizer. Instead of throwing it back in disgust, he kept it. When he returned to shore, he asked one of the farmers if the seaweed was useful. The farmer's eyes lit up. "This is exactly what I need for my fields. Would you sell it to me?" The money from the seaweed wasn't as much as fish would have brought, but it was something. And more than that, Sato realized he had just turned a failed fishing day into a successful day by changing what he was looking for. He began experimenting with this perspective. On days when fish weren't biting, instead of stubbornly keeping his nets in the water, he would pay attention to what else was happening. He noticed patterns in bird behavior that told him where fish might be on better days. He observed current changes that helped him understand seasonal movements. He collected things that others might value, certain shells, seaweed, and interesting stones. But perhaps most importantly, he stopped defining himself solely by the fish caught. He began to see himself not just as a fisherman, but as someone who harvested from the sea. Sometimes the harvest was fish. Sometimes it was knowledge. Sometimes it was presence of his wife. Sometimes it was objects that others valued for reasons he had never considered. Other fishermen noticed the change in Sato. He no longer came to shore on empty net days looking defeated and ashamed. He seemed interested in what he had found, curious about the day's experience even if it hadn't been conventionally successful. One young fisherman who was struggling with his own inconsistent catches asked Sato, "How do you stay positive when you fail?" "I stopped calling it failure," Sato replied. "Some days I catch fish. Some days I catch other things. Some days I catch nothing but return with more understanding of the sea. Every day has value if I'm looking for value rather than defining success narrowly." He showed the young fisherman his collection of interesting finds from supposedly failed days. If I had been catching fish every single day, I never would have noticed any of this. My failure to catch fish opened my attention to everything else. Now I know the sea that the most successful fishermen don't have, because their constant success never forced them to look at anything else. A Zen monk who was visiting the village heard about Sato's philosophy and came to talk with him. "You've learned something that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that failure and success are not opposites but neighbors. Sometimes what looks like failure is actually success, in a form you didn't recognize. Sometimes getting what you wanted would have prevented you from discovering something more valuable." Sato nodded. "For years, I prayed to the sea gods to never return with empty nets. Now I understand that the empty nets were answering a different prayer, one I didn't know I was making. They were teaching me to see value beyond the obvious, to measure worth by more than one standard, to be present to what is, rather than always grasping for what should be." The monk smiled. "The empty net is a great teacher. Because it's empty, it can receive anything. Because it failed to catch what you were seeking, it caught things you weren't looking for. Sometimes the best gifts come through the door of apparent failure." Years later, when Sato was old and teaching his grandson to fish, the boy became discouraged after several days with small catches. "Grandfather, I'm not good at this. I keep failing." Sato smiled and showed his grandson the collection he had accumulated over the years. Unusual shells, interesting stones, pieces of driftwood, observations written down about sea and weather, and recipes for using seaweed. All of these came from days when I caught few or no fish. If every day had been successful by the measure I was using, then I would never have discovered any of this. Sometimes the empty net brings exactly what you need, just not what you wanted. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't fear failure. Don't rush to judge whether a day was successful or not. Some of my best days looked like my worst days at the time. The measure of success that seems obvious often isn't the most important one. Keep your eyes open for what the sea is actually offering you, not just what you came looking for." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own empty nets. What apparent failures in your life might be successes, wearing different clothes? What disappointments might have brought gifts you were too focused on the disappointment to notice? What seemed like coming up empty might have actually been receiving something more valuable than what you were seeking. You don't need to catch fish every day. You don't need to succeed by conventional measures every time. Sometimes the empty net is exactly what you need, bringing lessons and gifts that success would have prevented you from receiving. Sometimes failure is just success that requires better eyes to see it. Rest now in acceptance of all your empty nets, all your apparent failures, all the times you came up short by the measures you were using. These weren't wastes. They were opportunities to learn different measures, to discover unexpected value, to receive what you weren't looking for but desperately needed. The empty net isn't a tragedy, it's a teaching. Let it teach you tonight, as you rest in the emptiness that's actually fullness waiting to be recognized. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here. Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking." Ren nodded with satisfaction. The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware. She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach. Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. In a monastery where monks practiced intensive meditation, there was a monk named Genzo, who struggled more than any of the others. While his fellow monks seemed to make progress, reporting experiences of insight and clarity, Genzo felt nothing but confusion and exhaustion. He tried so hard. He would sit in meditation until his legs ached and his back screamed. He would concentrate fiercely, trying to force his mind into the states he read about in the sutras. He would stay up late studying, trying to understand intellectually what he couldn't grasp experientially. But nothing seemed to work. While others reported breakthrough moments, sudden insights, and powerful experiences during meditation, Genzo just felt tired. So tired that he would sometimes fall asleep during meditation sessions, which filled him with shame. The other monks were achieving enlightenment, and he couldn't even stay awake. The monastery's teacher, Master Dogen, watched Genzo's struggle with patient concern. He saw how the young monk was wearing himself out, how the desperate striving was actually creating obstacles rather than removing them. One day, after Genzo had fallen asleep during meditation yet again and woken up mortified, Dogen called him aside. "Genzo, you look exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night?" "I can't afford to sleep, Master. I'm so far behind the others. I need to practice more, not less." "Go to your room and sleep," Dogen said gently. "That's not a suggestion. It's an instruction. Sleep for as long as your body needs." Genzo was confused but obedient. He went to his room, lay down, and immediately fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He slept through the afternoon, through the evening meditation, through the night, and into the next morning. When he finally woke, something was different. He couldn't name what had changed, but the world looked somehow clearer. The desperate striving that had consumed him was just gone. He felt a quietness inside that he'd never experienced before. He went to find Dogen, unsure what to say about this strange shift. "Master, something happened while I slept, but I don't know what. I feel different, but I didn't have any dramatic experience, any sudden insight. I just slept." Dogen smiled. "And in that sleep, you let go of trying. You let go of the desperate effort to achieve enlightenment. You stopped fighting with yourself. And in that letting go, what was always there became apparent." "But I didn't do anything," Genzo protested. "I just slept." "The others have profound experiences during meditation. I fell asleep." "Enlightenment isn't always dramatic," Dogen explained. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it comes not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. You've been trying so hard to wake up that you couldn't see you were already awake. You needed to sleep, to let go, to stop trying, for what's always been true to become obvious." Over the following days, Genzo noticed that the peace hadn't left him. It wasn't a dramatic altered state. It was more like a background quietness, a sense of okayness that didn't depend on circumstances. The desperate seeking was gone, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had realized he'd never lost it. Other monks asked him what had happened. "Did you have a breakthrough, a sudden awakening?" "I don't know," Genzo replied honestly. "I just slept. And when I woke up, something had shifted. But it wasn't like lightning striking. It was more like clouds clearing and realizing the sky had been there all along." Master Dogen used Genzo's experience to teach others. Many of you are waiting for dramatic enlightenment experiences. Thunder and lightning, profound insights, altered states. But enlightenment is often more subtle than that. It's the quiet recognition of what's always been true. It's the simple shift from trying to be at peace to noticing the peace that's already here. Years later, when Genzo told his story to students, he would laugh at his younger self. "I was trying so hard to wake up that I exhausted myself. I thought enlightenment was something to achieve through effort. But sometimes you have to stop trying to wake up and just let yourself sleep. Sometimes awakening comes through the door you're not watching." Tonight, stop trying so hard. Stop striving for perfect meditation or ideal relaxation or correct rest. Stop watching for enlightenment or breakthroughs or special experiences. Just sleep. Just let go. Just be tired and allow yourself rest without judgment. What you're seeking might come not through your effort, but through your willingness to stop efforting and simply be. Sleep through your own awakening if you must. It will be there when you wake. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he were stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. I saw your light, the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life. Tomoe brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim. After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. "I've noticed you've been struggling," the monk said gently. "Since your losses, I see the darkness in you." Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness?" The monk looked up at the lamp tower. "Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives?" "No," Tomo admitted. "It just needs to shine." "Exactly," the monk said. "You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another, but we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. You're saying I can be lost and still guide others? You already are, the monk replied. You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done. Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself? She asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. "Well, it mattered," the sailor said. "I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly, whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. "See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better. Yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack. running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest." Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way." He would show students 2 bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio. being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. "I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it." Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of Mu, in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned." My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one." The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. Kenzo has abandoned proper technique, they said. He's making mistakes deliberately. This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. The technique serves spontaneity, he would tell students. You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art. One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity. He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened. Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between: technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. There was a calligrapher named Setsuko who took great pride in her work. She would spend hours creating each character, each stroke perfect, each piece a work of art that she expected would last for generations. One day, she acquired a special ink that a merchant had brought from a distant province. The ink created beautiful deep blacks and flowed perfectly from her brush. But she soon discovered it had an unusual property. It never fully dried. Even days after she had finished a piece, the ink remained slightly wet. If you touched it, even carefully, it would smudge. At first, Setsuko was furious. She couldn't sell work that would smudge. She couldn't give pieces as gifts, knowing they would be ruined by the first careless touch. All her effort was going into work that couldn't be preserved. She tried everything to make the ink dry properly, but nothing worked. Finally, in frustration, she went to the merchant who had sold it to her, demanding her money back. The merchant looked surprised, but that's the nature of this ink. I told you it was special. Special? It's defective. It won't dry. Exactly, the merchant said. It's teaching ink. It reminds you that nothing you create is permanent. Your beautiful calligraphy will eventually fade, whether from age or damage or fire. This ink just makes the impermanence more obvious. Setsuko went home angry, but she couldn't stop thinking about the merchant's words. Everything she created would eventually be destroyed. The ink that wouldn't dry was just being honest about what was true of all her work. She began to approach her calligraphy differently. Instead of creating pieces meant to last forever, she started creating pieces meant for the moment. She would write on large papers and hang them in her studio, knowing they would slowly smudge and blur over time. She found this liberating. Each piece was perfect for now, and its eventual deterioration was part of its nature, not a tragedy. She began inviting people to come and breathe near her work, to let their breath slowly alter the still wet ink. The pieces became collaborations with time and circumstance, always changing, never fixed. I was trying to create permanent beauty, she told a student, but permanence doesn't exist. Everything changes. This ink taught me to make peace with that, to create beauty that's beautiful right now, without needing it to last forever. Tonight, what are you trying to make permanent that was always meant to change? What are you clinging to as if you could freeze it in time? Everything you love, everything you create, everything you are, it's all like ink that won't quite dry. Always shifting, always changing, always vulnerable to smudging. This isn't a tragedy. It's just the nature of existence. Let go of needing things to be permanent. Enjoy them while they're here. Create them knowing they'll change. Love them knowing they'll pass. The impermanence isn't the problem. Your fight against impermanence is. Rest now in the acceptance that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes this moment precious. In a mountain village, there lived a woman named Sayuri who had a reputation as an oracle. People would travel from distant places to seek her wisdom on important decisions. Should I marry this person? Should I pursue this business opportunity? Should I move to a new city? But Sayuri had an unusual way of responding to questions. She never gave direct answers. Instead, she would reply with more questions. A merchant came to her asking, "Should I invest in this new trade route?" Sayuri replied, "What would make that investment right for you? What would make it wrong? Which outcome could you live with more easily?" The merchant, frustrated, pressed her. "But what do you think I should do? Why does my opinion matter more than yours?" Sayuri asked. "You know your circumstances, your resources, your risk tolerance. I don't. How could my answer be better than the answer you would reach by examining your own wisdom?" People found this approach maddening. They wanted clear guidance, definite answers, someone to tell them what to do. Instead, Sayuri gave them questions that turned their attention inward. A young woman came asking whether she should accept a marriage proposal. "The man is suitable," she explained. "My family approves." but I feel uncertain." "What is the uncertainty?" Sayuri asked. "I don't know if I love him enough." "What is enough love for marriage?" Sayuri inquired. "Who defines that measure? And more importantly, what does your uncertainty tell you?" The young woman sat with these questions. Slowly, she realized she already knew her answer. The uncertainty wasn't confusion. It was clear trying to be heard beneath the noise of expectations and social pressure. She didn't want to marry this man. She had known it all along, but had been afraid to acknowledge it. "You already had your answer," Sayuri said when the woman expressed this realization. "You just needed permission to hear it. If I had told you what to do, you would have either resented me for the advice or become dependent on me for future decisions. But by asking questions, I helped you find your own wisdom. Now you trust yourself more than you did before." A farmer came with a more desperate question. His crops were failing, and he needed to decide whether to borrow money to try new methods or sell his land and find other work. "Please," he begged, "just tell me what to do. I can't decide." "What happens if you borrow and the new methods fail?" Sayuri asked. "I lose everything." "What happens if you sell the land?" "I lose my family's heritage, but I avoid debt." "Which loss could you live with?" Sayuri continued. "Losing everything, including your dignity, through failed debt? Or losing your land but keeping your freedom from debt? Which regret would be smaller?" The farmer thought deeply. He realized that he valued security over heritage. The land was important, but being debt-free was more important. Once he saw this clearly, his decision became obvious. "But what if I'm wrong?" he asked Sayuri. "What if you're right?" she countered. "Why assume the wrong choice is more likely than the right one? And even if you choose poorly, will you learn something? Will you adapt? Or will you be paralyzed forever by fear of making mistakes?" These questions shifted something in the farmer. He had been treating the decision as if one choice was absolutely right and the other absolutely wrong. But Sayuri's questions helped him see that both choices had consequences. Both involved trade-offs. And he needed to decide based on his values, not on some objective standard of rightness. Word spread about Sayuri's approach. Some people avoided her, frustrated that she wouldn't just give answers. But many sought her out precisely because she didn't. They recognized that her questions were a kind of teaching, helping them develop their own wisdom rather than borrowing hers. A Zen monk visited Sayuri, curious about her method. "You could make a good living telling people what to do," he observed. "They want certainty. They would pay well for it. Why do you refuse to give it?" "Because certainty from outside is false security," Sayuri replied. "If I tell someone what to do and it works out, they credit me and become dependent on me for future decisions. If it doesn't work out, they blame me and still haven't learned to trust themselves. Either way, I've made them weaker, not stronger." She poured tea for them both. But when I ask questions that help them find their own answers, they become stronger. They learn to consult their own wisdom. They develop confidence in their decision-making. Even if they choose poorly, they learn from their own mistakes rather than blaming someone else. The monk nodded thoughtfully. "Your questions are a form of teaching. You're not withholding wisdom. You're pointing people toward the wisdom they already possess." "Exactly," Sayuri agreed. Most people have more wisdom than they realize. They just don't trust it. They've been taught to look outside themselves for answers, to defer to authorities, to doubt their own judgment. My questions permit them to trust what they already know. She looked at the monk directly. The same is true in meditation practice, isn't it? A good teacher doesn't give you enlightenment. They ask questions or create situations that help you recognize what's already there. The wisdom isn't imported from outside. It's revealed from within. Yes, the monk agreed. The best teaching is the teaching that makes itself unnecessary by helping students trust their own understanding. Years passed, and Sayuri grew old. People worried about who would replace her as the village oracle. But Sayuri refused to train a successor. "I haven't been giving answers," she said. "I've been asking questions." Anyone can do that. You don't need a special oracle. You need to practice asking yourselves better questions. She taught the village a method. When facing a decision, ask yourself questions instead of seeking immediate answers. What do I value most in this situation? What outcome could I live with most easily? What does my hesitation tell me? What would I advise a friend in this situation? What do I already know that I'm afraid to acknowledge? These questions, Sayuri explained, are tools for excavating your own wisdom. The answers are already in you. You just need to dig them out from under the layers of fear, expectation, and conditioning. On her deathbed, surrounded by villagers who had come to thank her for her guidance over the years, someone asked, "Sayuri, what is the most important question?" Even then, she smiled and replied with a question. What question would help you most right now? And when you've answered that, what question would help you next? The most important question is always the one that moves you deeper into your own understanding. Tonight, as you rest, what questions might you ask yourself? Not demanding answers, not forcing resolution, just inquiring gently into your own experience. What am I feeling right now? What do I need in this moment? What wisdom am I carrying that I haven't yet listened to? What am I afraid to acknowledge? You don't need someone else's answers. You don't need an oracle or expert to tell you what to do, how to feel, who to be. The wisdom is already in you, has always been in you, waiting for the right questions to draw it out. Ask yourself questions tonight and listen for the answers that rise from your own depths. They're more trustworthy than anything someone else could tell you. Rest now in your own wisdom, asking and listening, questioning and discovering. The oracle you seek is you. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a monastery, there was a meditation hall with a heavy wooden door that was always kept closed during practice sessions. The door had no lock, but everyone treated it as if it were locked, entering only at designated times and never leaving during meditation periods. A visiting monk named Gensho noticed this and asked why no one ever left during meditation, even though the door was clearly unlocked. "It wouldn't be proper," one monk explained. "During practice time, we stay in practice. Leaving would break the container, would disturb others, would show a lack of discipline." "But you could leave if you wanted to?" Gensho asked. "Technically, yes, but we don't." Gensho found this fascinating. These monks were living as if imprisoned during meditation sessions. But the prison existed only in their minds. The door was open. They could leave any time, yet they sat as if bound. He began to notice similar patterns throughout the monastery. People living within invisible constraints, following rules that had no enforcement mechanism, restricting themselves to prisons that had no walls. One day, during a particularly long meditation session, Gensho stood up, walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the sunlight, and then walked back in and sat down. The other monks were shocked by this violation of protocol. Afterward, the abbot called Gensho to his chambers. "Why did you leave during meditation?" "To see if I could," Gensho replied, "to test whether the constraint was real or imagined." It was imagined. The door was never locked. I was never actually trapped. I was sitting there by choice, not by compulsion. "But we all know we could leave," the abbot said. "The point is that we choose not to." "Do you really know that?" Gensho asked. "Or have you assumed for so long that you shouldn't leave that you've forgotten you have a choice? There's a difference between staying by conscious choice and staying by habit or assumed constraint. One is freedom. The other is just a comfortable prison." This question disturbed many monks. They began to realize they had been treating many choices as if they were requirements. They had been living within restrictions that no one was actually enforcing. They had imprisoned themselves with beliefs about what they should or shouldn't do. The abbot considered Gensho's point carefully. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been treating the open door as if it were locked. We've been prisoners of our own assumptions. But what do we do with this awareness?" "First, acknowledge it," Gensho said. "See clearly that most of your constraints are chosen, not imposed. Then decide consciously, which constraints serve you? Which do you want to keep? And which are you maintaining out of habit or fear, not because they actually help you?" He gestured toward the meditation hall. "That door has always been open, but if you never test that, if you never actually check whether you could leave, then you're living as if imprisoned, even though you're free. True freedom begins with recognizing which prisons are real and which are imagined." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the monastery changed. Monks began questioning which rules actually served their practice and which they followed out of mere habit. They discovered they had internalized many restrictions that had no actual external enforcement. One monk realized he had been afraid to speak his honest opinions for years, not because speaking was forbidden, but because he had decided early on that it was safer to stay quiet. No one had actually silenced him. He had silenced himself. Another monk discovered he had been avoiding certain foods, not because of any monastic rule, but because he had once been told they were inappropriate for monks, and he had never questioned this. The restriction existed only in his belief. A third monk realized he had been limiting his meditation practice to certain times and places, not because practice was restricted to those times, but because he had created a mental rule about when and where meditation counted. "We've been living in prisons of our own making," one monk said during a group discussion. "The doors were open all along. We just never tried to walk through them." Gensho nodded. "Most people live this way. They believe they're trapped in circumstances, jobs, relationships, and patterns of behavior. They believe they have no choice. But often, if they examined closely, they'd discover the constraints are their own beliefs, not external reality. The door was never locked. The abbot asked, "But doesn't this lead to chaos? If everyone starts leaving meditation sessions whenever they want, ignoring the schedule, doing what they please, doesn't the structure fall apart?" "Possibly," Gensho agreed. "But structure maintained through unconscious compliance isn't real structure. It's just a habit pretending to be discipline. True structure comes from conscious choice. When people choose to stay, not because they believe they must, but because they genuinely want to, that's authentic practice. When they stay simply because they never questioned whether they could leave, that's just imprisonment with no walls." He looked around at the gathered monks. "I'm not suggesting you abandon all structure or discipline. I'm suggesting you own your choices. Recognize that you're staying because you choose to, not because you have to. Recognize that the door is open and you're free to leave, and then decide whether to stay or go based on authentic choice rather than assumed constraint." This teaching spread beyond the monastery. People in the nearby town heard about the open door and began examining their own lives. How many constraints were they living under that existed only in their minds? How many prisons had they created for themselves? A woman realized she had been staying in an unhappy marriage not because of any real obstacle to leaving, but because of stories she told herself about what leaving would mean. When she examined these stories, she found they were beliefs, not facts. The door had always been open. A man discovered he had been working at a job he hated for years, believing he had no choice, that his family responsibilities required it. When he looked honestly, he found there were other options he had never seriously considered, because he had assumed from the beginning that he was trapped. An elderly person recognized that many of the limitations they experienced weren't from age or circumstance, but from beliefs about what old people could or couldn't do. The constraints were largely self-imposed. The teaching of the open door, people began to say, is that most prisons are mental. We're free more often than we realize. The question isn't whether we can leave, but whether we've been living as if we can't. Years later, the monastery still practiced meditation with a closed door during sessions. But now there was a different quality to it. Everyone knew the door was unlocked. Everyone knew they could leave any time they chose. They stayed not from obligation or assumed constraint, but from authentic choice. The practice deepened because people were choosing it freely, rather than submitting to it from habit or fear. Gensho's simple act of walking out and back in had freed an entire community from invisible prisons, not by tearing down structure, but by revealing that structure maintained by genuine choice is stronger than structure maintained by unconscious compliance. Tonight, as you rest, you might examine the doors in your own life. Which ones do you believe are locked? Which constraints do you accept as unchangeable? What prisons are you living in that exist only in your beliefs? The door has always been open. You've always been freer than you realized. The constraints that feel so solid are often just habits of thought, beliefs you've never questioned, stories you've told yourself for so long that you mistake them for truth. You're not as trapped as you think. You have more choices than you've acknowledged. The prison is mostly mental, and mental prisons can be walked out of the moment you realize the door was never actually locked. This doesn't mean every choice is easy or without consequences, but it means you're choosing even when you believe you have no choice. And recognizing that your choosing is the beginning of real freedom. Rest now in the understanding that you're freer than you knew. The door is open. It's always been open. You can stay or go based on authentic choice, not on assumed necessity. This recognition doesn't require you to change anything external. It just requires you to see clearly. The constraints you live under are more permeable than you thought. You've had more freedom all along. You just haven't been exercising it. Sleep now as a free person, aware that tomorrow you can walk through any open door you choose, or stay where you are by genuine choice, rather than imagined imprisonment. The freedom was always yours. Now you know it. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a province divided by a deep gorge, there lived a master bridge builder named Kazuo. He had constructed bridges across rivers, over valleys, spanning impossible distances. His bridges were renowned for their strength and elegance. People traveled safely across waters and heights that would otherwise have been impassable, all thanks to Kazuo's skill and courage. But Kazuo harbored a secret that no one suspected. He was terrified of heights. This fear had been with him since childhood, since the day he had climbed too high in a tree and fallen, breaking his arm. The memory of that fall, the stomach-dropping sensation of nothing beneath him, had never left. Yet somehow, he had become a bridge builder, perhaps because he wanted to conquer this fear, or perhaps because he wanted to create safe passage for others over the very thing that terrified him. For years, Kazuo managed his fear through careful strategy. He would design the bridges in his workshop, calculate every measurement, supervise construction from solid ground. His apprentices would do the high work, walking the beams, securing the cables, testing the spans. Kazuo would stay below, calling instructions, his feet planted firmly on earth. His bridges were masterpieces of engineering. Each one stood as testament to his brilliant mind. But Kazuo knew the truth. He had never once walked across one of his own bridges. He had never felt the sway of the structure he designed. He had never looked down from the height his calculations assured was safe. This secret gnawed at him. He felt like a fraud. How could he call himself a master bridge builder if he was too afraid to cross his own creations? One spring, the provincial governor commissioned Kazuo to build his most ambitious bridge yet, a span across the deepest part of the gorge, connecting two mountain villages that had been isolated from each other for generations. The bridge would need to be long, high, and strong enough to withstand the winds that howled through the gorge. Kazuo accepted the commission. He drew the plans, made the calculations, selected the materials. Construction began, and as always, his apprentices did the high work while Kazuo supervised from below. The bridge took 2 years to complete. When it was finished, it was magnificent. A graceful arc of wood and rope and stone spanning the gorge like a prayer made solid. People came from distant villages just to see it. The day before the official opening ceremony, Kazuo stood at one end of the bridge, looking across to the other side. The governor had requested that Kazuo himself cut the ceremonial ribbon at the center of the span to honor his achievement. This would require Kazuo to walk halfway across his own bridge, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Kazuo felt his heart hammering in his chest. He looked down into the gorge, a distance that made his vision swim. He couldn't do it. He simply couldn't. That night, Kazuo didn't sleep. He lay in his bed, shame and fear warring inside him. By morning, he had decided he would tell the governor he was ill. He would send an apprentice to cut the ribbon. He would find some way to avoid the truth. But before dawn, there was a knock at his door. It was Yuki, his senior apprentice, a young woman who had worked with him for 5 years. "Master," she said, "I know your secret." Kazuo's face went pale. "What secret?" "Your fear of heights. I've known for years. We all have." Kazuo sat down heavily. "Then you know I'm a fraud." "No," Yuki said firmly. "I know you're human, but I also know something else. May I show you?" She led Kazuo to the bridge in the pre-dawn darkness. They stood at its entrance, looking across the span that was barely visible in the dim light. "Master," Yuki said, "may I tell you what I've learned working with you? Every bridge begins as fear. Fear of the gap, fear of the height, fear of the distance. That's why bridges exist, to address fear. You think your fear disqualifies you from building bridges, but actually your fear is what makes you the best bridge builder I've ever known." "How can that be?" Kazuo asked. "I'm too afraid to even walk across them." "Exactly," Yuki replied. "Someone without fear might build a careless bridge. They might miscalculate, might miss a danger because they don't feel in their bones how high the stakes are. But you check every measurement 3 times. You select materials with obsessive care. You design with such caution, such attention to every possible failure point, because you understand fear. Your bridges are so safe precisely because you're so afraid." She stepped onto the bridge, her feet confident on the boards. "Come. Just 1 step." Kazuo took 1 step onto the bridge. His legs trembled. "The fear you're feeling," Yuki said. "Where is it? Is it in the bridge?" Kazuo looked down at the solid boards beneath his feet. "No, the bridge is fine." "Is it in the gorge? Is the gorge reaching up to hurt you?" "No." "So where is the fear?" Kazuo touched his chest. "It's in me. It's in my mind." "Yes," Yuki said gently. "The danger you fear exists only in your imagination. The bridge is real, the gorge is real, but the catastrophe you're imagining, the falling, the failing, the shame, that's not real. That's a story your mind is telling about what might happen, not what is happening." She took another step. "Come, 1 more step. Don't think about the whole bridge, just this 1 step." Kazuo took another step, then another. He kept his eyes on Yuki, on the boards directly beneath him, not looking down into the gorge, not thinking about the distance to the other side. "The fear says you'll fall," Yuki continued, walking slowly backward, leading him forward. "But have you fallen? The fear says you can't do this, but are you doing it?" Step by step, they moved across the bridge. Kazuo's breathing was ragged, his hands shaking, but he didn't stop. He focused only on the present step, the present board, the present moment. "The obstacle," Yuki said, "was never the height. It was never the gorge. It was the story in your mind about what the height and the gorge meant. The bridge you needed to cross wasn't this one. It was the gap between your fear and your action. They reached the center of the bridge. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Yuki stopped. "This is where you'll stand today," she said. "Where you'll cut the ribbon. Where you'll acknowledge your achievement. Can you do it?" Kazuo looked around, truly seeing for the first time where he stood. He was at the center of his own creation, high above the gorge, and he was not falling. The bridge held him. The structure he had designed was keeping him safe, just as he had calculated it would. "I built this," he said, wonder in his voice. "I built something strong enough to hold me, even though I was afraid." "You built more than a bridge," Yuki replied. "You built proof that fear doesn't have to stop creation. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. Every bridge you've ever built was an act of courage, Master. You just couldn't see it because you were looking at your fear instead of your actions." They walked back across the bridge together as the sun rose. This time, Kazuo looked down into the gorge, really looked. It was deep, yes. The height was real, yes. But the bridge was also real. His knowledge was real. His years of careful calculation were real. The fear was just one truth among many, not the only truth. That afternoon, when the ceremony began, Kazuo walked across his bridge in front of hundreds of people. His hands still shook slightly. His heart still beat fast. The fear didn't disappear, but he walked anyway. And when he reached the center and cut the ceremonial ribbon, he felt something he had never felt before. Not the absence of fear, but freedom in spite of it. In the years that followed, Kazuo still felt fear when he crossed bridges, even his own. But he crossed them anyway. He learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about recognizing fear as a feeling, not a fact, as a story the mind tells, not a truth that must be obeyed. He would tell his students, "The obstacles that stop us are rarely as solid as they seem. Most of them are built not of stone and distance, but of belief and imagination. We think we can't, and so we don't try. We imagine failure so vividly that we mistake the imagination for reality. But if you take one step, then another, focusing only on what's real in this moment, rather than what's imagined about the future, you often find that the obstacle dissolves. It was never as solid as you believed." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the bridges you haven't crossed because of fear. What obstacles exist primarily in your imagination? What catastrophes are you so certain will happen that you never test whether they're true? What would one step look like? Just one step, not the whole journey, just the present moment's possible action. Your mind will tell you stories about falling, failing, being hurt or humiliated. These stories feel so real that you mistake them for prophecy, but they're just stories. The present moment is offering you solid boards beneath your feet, a structure that can hold you, a possibility you've been afraid to test. The bridge is stronger than your fear of it, and you are stronger than the stories your mind tells about what you cannot do. Rest now in this truth. Let your fears be what they are, feelings, not facts. And know that tomorrow, if you choose, you can take one step onto a bridge you've been afraid to cross. Just one step. That's all courage ever requires. In a village known for its beautiful gardens, there lived a gardener named Sora, who had inherited a plot of land from her grandmother. It was good land, fertile soil, adequate water, positioned to receive both morning and afternoon sun. Sora's neighbours on every side had transformed their properties into showcases of horticultural ambition. There were formal gardens with meticulously pruned trees, vegetable gardens yielding abundant crops, flower gardens that bloomed in careful succession throughout the seasons. But Sora's plot remained empty. Month after month, season after season, year after year, Sora did nothing with her land. She didn't plant, she didn't build, she didn't design or plan or cultivate. She simply left it alone. The neighbours whispered about this. What a waste, they said. Such good land going unused. Some thought Sora was lazy. Others thought she was confused, perhaps not knowing how to garden. A few felt insulted, as if Sora's empty plot was a criticism of their own elaborate efforts. One neighbour, a proud man named Takeshi, whose garden featured rare specimens from distant provinces, finally confronted Sora one spring morning. "Excuse me," he said, his tone barely polite, "but don't you think you should do something with your land? It's an eyesore, frankly, just weeds and wild grass. You're bringing down the beauty of the whole neighborhood." Sora, who had been sitting on her porch drinking tea, smiled gently. "What would you suggest I plant?" "Well, anything," Takeshi gestured expansively. "Vegetables, flowers, trees. Something useful or beautiful. Something that shows you care." "Come," Sora said, standing up. "Let me show you something." She led Takeshi into her supposedly empty plot, but as they walked among the unmown grass and untamed growth, Takeshi began to notice things he hadn't seen from a distance. There were wild flowers he had never seen in cultivated gardens, small, delicate blooms that seemed to glow in the morning light. There were butterflies of species he'd never encountered in his own carefully managed space. Birds nested in the natural tangles of vegetation, singing songs that his pruned and ordered trees never hosted. "Look here," Sora said, kneeling by a patch of plants. "These herbs grow wild here. They're medicinal. I gather them for the village doctor. And see this area? In autumn, mushrooms appear here that are delicious and valuable. I don't plant them. They simply come because the conditions are right." She stood and walked further into the space. "This grass that looks so messy to you, it's habitat for insects that pollinate crops for miles around. Those weeds you mentioned, several are actually rare native plants that have disappeared from cultivated areas. They only survive here because I don't pull them out." Takeshi looked around with new eyes. What he had seen as neglected chaos was actually a thriving ecosystem. What he had judged as emptiness was actually fullness of a different kind. "But you didn't plant any of this," he said, still confused. "You didn't make it happen." "Exactly," Sora replied. "I didn't plant because the land knew better than I did what should grow here. My grandmother taught me this. She said, sometimes the wisest action is to do nothing. Not from laziness, but from trust. Trust that nature has its own intelligence. Trust that things want to grow. Trust that not every space needs to be controlled and designed and managed." She bent down and touched the wild grass gently. "If I had planted a formal garden, I would be fighting against this land's nature. I would pull these native plants to make room for what I decided should be here. I would disrupt the birds and butterflies. I would impose my idea of beauty onto something that already has its own beauty. And I would be working constantly, weeding, watering, pruning, managing. Instead, I do almost nothing, and look what abundance appears. Takeshi was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own garden, the hours of work it demanded, the constant vigilance against anything growing where he hadn't planned, the way he fought against the land's own tendencies to maintain his vision of order and beauty. "But don't you want to create something?" he asked. "Don't you want to make your mark?" "I am making my mark," Sora said. "I'm making it by not making it. I'm creating space for things to be what they naturally are, rather than forcing them to be what I think they should be. My grandmother said this too. Wu Wei, action through non-action. The doing that comes from not doing. This is not the same as doing nothing. This is carefully doing nothing, intentionally not interfering, wisely allowing." Over the following months, Takeshi found himself visiting Sora's wild plot more often. There was something restful about it, something his own controlled garden didn't offer. In his garden, every plant was in its place, every edge was trimmed, everything was as it should be, according to his plan. It was beautiful, but it was also rigid, tense. It required constant maintenance to prevent nature from asserting its own ideas. In Sora's plot, everything was relaxed. Plants grew where they wanted. Animals came and went freely. The whole space had a quality of natural ease that invited him to ease as well. One day he asked Sora, "How do you know when to act and when not to act? How do you know when doing nothing is wisdom and when it's just avoidance?" Sora thought about this carefully. "I watch," she said. "I pay attention. When I see something struggling that needs help, I help. When I see something growing well on its own, I leave it alone. When I see an invasive plant that will choke out everything else, I remove it. But most of the time, I just watch and trust. The land tells me what it needs. I don't impose my ideas onto it." She smiled. "You know the difference in your own life, don't you? Sometimes you push when pushing is needed. Sometimes you rest when rest is needed. Sometimes you act. Sometimes you wait. The wisdom is in knowing which is which. Not having a rule that you must always act or must always do nothing, but being present enough to sense what this particular moment is asking for." Years passed. Sora's plot remained unplanted, but it became known throughout the region as a refuge for rare plants and animals. Scientists visited to study the species that had disappeared from more cultivated areas but thrived in her space. Children came to see the butterflies and birds. People feeling stressed would sit at the edge of her property, finding peace in its wild beauty. Takeshi gradually changed his approach to his own garden. He didn't abandon it entirely, but he created areas where he did less, managed less, controlled less. And he was surprised to find that these areas often became his favorites. The places where unexpected beauty appeared, where nature revealed its own intelligence. One evening, sitting with Sora on her porch, looking out at her wild plot as fireflies began to light up the dusk, Takeshi said, "I used to think you were lazy. Now I understand you were wise. You saw that not every space needs to be filled. Not every plan needs to be executed. Not every action needs to be taken. Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is create space and then get out of the way." Sora nodded. My grandmother had one more saying. The usefulness of a cup is in its emptiness. The usefulness of a house is in its empty space. The usefulness of action is in the space around it where non-action lives. You cannot act wisely if you're always acting. You cannot create room for things to grow if you're always filling every space with your own ideas. She sipped her tea, watching the fireflies. I didn't plant this garden, but I tended it through my not planting. I created it through my not creating, and what appeared was more beautiful, more alive, more true than anything I could have forced into being. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where in your life you're overacting, over-planning, over-controlling. Where are you filling space that might be better left empty? Where are you imposing your will onto something that has its own wisdom? Where are you so busy doing that you've forgotten the power of allowing? Rest itself is a practice of productive non-action. You don't make yourself sleep. You create conditions for sleep and then get out of the way. You don't force relaxation. You allow it by ceasing to prevent it. Let yourself be like Sora's empty garden tonight, unplanted, unmanaged, allowed to be what it naturally wants to be. Trust that things want to grow, want to rest, want to restore themselves. Your job isn't to force this process, but to create space for it, and then wisely, carefully, intentionally do nothing at all. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is nothing, and sometimes doing nothing is the hardest, most important work of all. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In the capital city, there was a mirror maker named Eiji, who had perfected his craft over decades. His mirrors were renowned for their clarity. When you looked into one of Eiji's mirrors, you saw yourself exactly as you were. No distortion, no wavering, no cloudiness. Just pure, clear reflection. But Eiji had a strange habit that puzzled his apprentices. After crafting each mirror, after polishing it to perfect clarity, he would sit before it for an hour just looking. Not at his own reflection, but at the mirror itself. Or so it seemed. When asked what he was doing, he would only smile and say, "I'm learning from it." One day, a young apprentice named Hana gathered her courage and asked directly, "Master, what does a mirror have to teach?" "It only reflects what's placed before it." Eiji gestured for her to sit beside him in front of a newly completed mirror. "Look at this mirror," he said. "What do you see?" "I see my reflection," Hana replied. "Yes. And what does the mirror think about your reflection?" Hana frowned. "Mirrors don't think." "Exactly. The mirror doesn't think you're beautiful or ugly. It doesn't judge you as good or bad. It doesn't prefer one face over another. It simply reflects what is without adding anything of its own. This is the mirror's teaching." He stood up and moved away, leaving the mirror empty of human reflections. "Now what does it reflect?" he asked. "The wall behind it, the window, the light. And does it complain that the wall is less interesting than a human face? Does it wish the light would be different? Does it try to improve what it reflects?" "No," Hana said slowly, beginning to understand. "It just reflects whatever appears before it, without preference." "This," Eiji said, sitting back down, "is how I try to experience life. like a mirror, awareness that reflects everything without distortion, without judgment, without trying to change what appears. Hannah thought about this. But we're not mirrors. We have thoughts, feelings, preferences. We judge constantly. Yes, A.G. agreed, but beneath all those thoughts and judgments is pure awareness, the part of you that simply sees, simply knows, simply experiences without adding commentary. This awareness is like a mirror. It reflects your thoughts, but it doesn't judge them. It reflects your feelings, but it doesn't resist them. It reflects reality, but it doesn't try to change it into something else. He pointed to the mirror again. When you look in this mirror, it shows you exactly what you are in this moment. If you smile, it shows you smiling. If you frown, it shows you frowning. It doesn't try to make you smile when you're sad. It doesn't criticize you for frowning. It just faithfully, honestly, clearly reflects what is. Hannah stared at the mirror, seeing herself reflected there. She noticed how her mind immediately started judging what she saw. Her nose was too wide, her hair was messy, she looked tired. But the mirror itself held no such judgments. It simply showed her face with perfect neutrality. The suffering we create, A.G. continued, comes largely from our inability to be like mirrors. We see what is, and immediately we add our opinions about what is. We see a thought, and we judge it as good or bad. We see a feeling, and we resist it or cling to it. We see reality, and we compare it to how we think it should be. All of this is distortion, adding things that aren't really there. He stood and walked to where several mirrors stood in various stages of completion. He picked up one that was cloudy, its surface rough. "This mirror distorts," he said, showing Hannah the wavy, unclear reflection it produced. "When you look in it, you can't see yourself clearly. Your image is bent, confused. This is what our minds do when they're full of judgment and resistance and preferences. We can't see reality clearly because we're constantly bending it, distorting it, making it into something that confirms our beliefs." He set down the cloudy mirror and picked up one that was highly polished. "But this mirror," he held it up, showing Hannah her clear reflection, "adds nothing. It has no agenda. It doesn't care what appears before it. It just faithfully reflects moment by moment whatever is present. And in that faithful reflection, there's a kind of peace." Over the following weeks, Hannah began to practice what she called mirror awareness. When thoughts appeared in her mind, instead of immediately judging them or getting caught up in their content, she would try to simply reflect them, to be aware that thinking was happening without adding a second layer of thought about the first layer. When emotions arose, instead of immediately trying to push them away or figure out why she was feeling them, she would try to simply reflect them, to notice that sadness was present or anger was present, the way a mirror might notice a cloud passing across its surface. It was harder than she expected. Her mind wanted to comment on everything, to judge, to analyze, to fix. But gradually, she learned to find that space of pure awareness beneath all the commentary, and she discovered that A.G. was right. There was a peace in simply reflecting reality without trying to change it. One evening, a wealthy merchant came to A.G.'s workshop in great distress. He had commissioned an elaborate mirror for his home, but when A.G. delivered it, the merchant had rejected it. "This mirror makes me look old," the merchant complained. "It shows every flaw, every line on my face. I want a mirror that makes me look better." Eiji listened patiently, then said gently, "The mirror shows you exactly as you are. If you look old, it's because you are aging, as all humans do. The mirror doesn't judge this as good or bad. It simply reflects truth." "Then I don't want truth," the merchant said angrily. "I want to look young and handsome." "I could make you a distorted mirror," Eiji offered. "One that softens lines and changes proportions. It would lie to you, but perhaps that would make you happier." The merchant paused, realizing how foolish he sounded. He looked at himself in the clear mirror again, really looked. Yes, he was aging. Yes, there were lines on his face, but the mirror wasn't judging him. Only he was judging himself. "The mirror accepts you exactly as you are," Eiji said softly. "Perhaps you could learn to do the same." The merchant stood there for a long time, looking at his reflection without judgment, trying to see himself the way the mirror saw him. Just a face, just a person, just what is, without the weight of good or bad, young or old, handsome or ugly. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take the mirror," he said quietly. Years later, when Hana had become a master mirror maker herself, students would ask her the same question she had once asked Eiji. "What does a mirror have to teach?" And she would reply, just as Eiji had, "A mirror teaches us pure awareness. It shows us that we can experience life without constantly judging it, resisting it, trying to change it into something else. We can simply reflect what is, clearly and faithfully, without distortion. And in that clear reflection, we find a peace that judgment can never provide." She would hold up a polished mirror, turning it so light played across its surface. "Your deepest nature is like this mirror, pure awareness that reflects everything but clings to nothing, that sees everything but judges nothing, that accepts everything exactly as it is. When you can rest in this mirror-like awareness, even for a moment, you discover that peace doesn't depend on changing what you reflect. It depends on reflecting clearly, without adding the distortion of your own resistance and judgment." Tonight, as you rest, you might practice mirror awareness. Let thoughts appear and disappear like images crossing a mirror's surface. Let feelings rise and fall like reflections that come and go. Don't judge what appears. Don't try to change it. Just reflect it clearly, the way a mirror reflects light, faithfully, honestly, without adding anything of your own. You are not the content of your thoughts and feelings. You are the awareness that reflects them. And that awareness, like a perfect mirror, is always clear, always peaceful, always unchanged by whatever passes across its surface. Rest in your mirror nature tonight. Reflect everything, cling to nothing, judge nothing. Just be aware, purely and simply aware, and let that awareness be enough. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.